All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. Sean Payton is gone. Tom Brady may be soon following suit. And does that move the needle for the Falcons to make a run at the NFC South crown in 2022? I'll be answering that question and more on today's Friday Q&A mailbag episode.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, writing weekly content for the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today is a Friday mailbag / Q&A episode where I will be answering your listener questions. You guys sent in a bunch of them. Some of them talking about why the Falcons haven't prioritized the pass rush, whether or not Matt Ryan should take a pay cut. We got a bunch of questions surrounding the wide receiver position and talking a little bit about whether we should use Calvin Ridley as a part of a trade package to trade up in the draft. We'll be talking about whether or not the Falcons could trade back in the draft, some wide receivers and running backs that may fit for the Falcons early in this draft. And the sort of the big topic of the day, however, will be that talking about the NFC South changes with Sean Payton stepping down as the New Orleans Saints coach, Tom Brady mulling over retirement, and whether or not that means that the Falcons could make a definitive run at the NFC South crown this upcoming season. We'll get into that, but I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify, and of course now free and available on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons podcast and give us a like while you do. So our first question comes from Wiley D at Brother-in-Law ATL. He asks, in light of the stories that Sean Payton may not return to New Orleans and Brady's potential retirement, would you mind discussing how these developments would impact the Falcons 2022 season if that were to come to fruition? And Wiley D sent us in, I think the day before Payton officially stepped aside. But, I don't think it necessarily moves the needle all that much for the Falcons. I certainly think it probably increases the odds that you might win one or more games in the division next year, because now your chances of splitting with the Bucs go up. But it's hard for me to imagine, especially given all the narratives that I've seen from various folks, particularly from a certain select group of Falcon fans and Falcons media, that, not only insist that the Falcons have a terrible roster, but also now that the division crown is up for grabs, like those teams seem to be two compatible ideas. Like I wonder how much improvement those folks that think the Falcons have a bad roster think that the Falcons will undergo this in one single offseason to really make a run at this thing. And I'll use another team for an example. Like you look at a team like the Detroit Lions, who I think most people would agree have one of the worst rosters in the NFL. And what happens if Aaron Rodgers gets traded from Green Bay? Yeah, you would sit there and say, yeah, the NFC North doesn't have that one team at the top of the division anymore, and it's up for grabs. But how many of those people would sit here and say, now it's Detroit's division for the taking? Probably not very many. So it's one of those things where I do feel like those two ideas, at least when it comes to the Falcons, there's some maybe rose-colored glasses there that are sort of obscuring folks. It's just hard for me to understand. Like you can sit here and think that the Falcons could make a legit run at the division next year, but it's hard for me to understand how you think that if they also have one of the worst rosters in the NFL, right? And you can also think the Falcons have one of the worst rosters in the NFL, but then how do you think that they're going to make a run at the division? Like how much, improvement do you expect from them? And ultimately, when it comes within the division, like the main reason why the Saints and Bucs tend to control those matchups with the Falcons, while Payton and Brady certainly are significant parts of that, at the end of the day, can the Falcons close the gap in the trenches? Like that's really where the team has struggled against those teams. That's really where the team is potentially going to struggle against the bulk of the teams that they face this upcoming season. Can they win the battle in the trenches? And right now, obviously, we're not looking at that group currently and thinking that they can. So again, I asked the question, like, how much improvement do you really realistically expect for the team to make? Are that we going to be able to block Vita Vea? Are we going to be able to block Shaq Barrett? Are we going to be able to block Cameron Jordan? Or do you think the guys that we have already on the roster can do those things? All right. What about Myles Garrett? What about TJ Watt next year? What about Aaron Donald, Nick Bosa? All these guys that we're going to be facing, Joey Bosa, in next year's schedule. Can we block those guys? If we can block those guys, then yeah, we got a shot. Right. But for me, I look at it like, how many division games do you think we're going to win? Like 3, 4 now? Right. How many non-divisional games? You think we're going to win 5 or more games outside the division against the AFC North and the NFC West and the Chargers? I don't know. So you tell me. So I don't know if it really moves the needle for me personally, unless I see the Falcons make significant improvements in the trenches. Now, it's certainly possible that they can do that. I'm not going to sit here and expect them to go from a bottom 5 offensive line to a top 5 offensive line. I'm not expecting them to go to the worst pass rush in the NFL to a top 15 pass rush in the NFL. It's certainly possible that they could do that. Don't get me wrong. But again, unless you think that's happening, it's hard for me to sit here and be optimistic about this team's ability to compete for a postseason spot next year. So we'll just sort of have to see. Again, we'll revisit this topic when we get to March. We revisit this topic when we get to April. And certainly when we have the most of the offseason in the rear view in May, we can revisit this topic to see how much improvement the Falcons have made along the trenches. But that, to me, holds the key to their success in this upcoming season. Moving on to Corey Charon's question. He's at Buffalo Head 1 on Twitter. He asked 2 questions. Why do you think it has been so rare for the Falcons to prioritize the pass rush for so many years? Seems they have prioritized almost everywhere else throughout the years. And why is there no more talk of Ryan taking a pay cut rather than just restructuring and extensions? He has made a ton of money. More cap space would help him on the field, which would make him better and more likely to extend his career in Atlanta or elsewhere. At this point, isn't successful play and leading a good team more important than money for his legacy? Ending his career with 5 or 6 losing seasons certainly doesn't help his Hall of Fame chances. As far as the Falcons prioritizing the pass rush, they have at various points in the past, right? 2015 through 2017, they did prioritize the pass rush. The problem was that they got complacent in 2018 and 2019, believing that the investments that they made in those years, namely Vic Beasley and Takk McKinley, would pay off and those guys would develop into premium pass rushers. They did, of course, not. And then that forced the Falcons to have to reinvest in that position in 2020, hoping that Dante Fowler, Marlon Davidson, and Charles Harris would solve that problem. And of course, so far, unless Davidson can really turn it around, we know Fowler and Harris did not work out for the team, and so far it doesn't look like Davidson's going to work out for the team. As for Matt Ryan taking a pay cut, just if I can step into the shoes of Tom Condon, his agent, I would sit here and tell you, why should he take a pay cut? If you don't want to pay him his contract, then trade him. That would be my response as his agent. Now, as the host of Locked On Falcons, I would say, you look at some of these other aging quarterbacks. Tom Brady around age 36 was counting about 9% of the Patriots salary cap, from age 36 to age 40. Drew Brees was about 12% of the Saints salary cap from age 36 to age 40. And if you project, what the salary cap is going to be over the next 3 years based off of over the cap's projections, that's $208 million this upcoming season, $225 in 2023, and $256 in 2024. 9% of that would be about $62 million, so an average about $21 million a year. 12% would be about $82 million, so a little shy of around $27 million a year. So if Matt Ryan's going to, take a pay cut, like that's about what you're looking at. And right now, his current contract is about $30 million a year. You look at how much we owe him, even if you were to get him to defer those roster bonuses that he's owed over the next 2 years, we still owe him, and then do a max restructure, we still owe him about $57 million at least over the next 2 years. And that's about 13% of the salary cap. So, I think when you look at this situation, like, I don't know if you'll get Matt Ryan to take a pay cut. Certainly, I think it's fair for fans to ask that question, but at the same time, like when Brady and Brees were taking those discounts for their respective teams, they were also teams on the verge of winning a Super Bowl. The Falcons, at least, again, going back to the point made earlier, how far are the Falcons away from doing that? And does an extra, $8 million here or $5 million here really going to really move the needle in that regard? So if you're Matt Ryan or his agent, at least, again, Matt Ryan might have a different opinion, but his agent was like, screw that. I'm not, I'm not lowering my cut just so the Falcons can, re-sign Cordero Patterson. That ain't doing the difference. That ain't the reason why they'll win 11 games next year, So I don't know. I think it's a fair question to ask, but like, it doesn't seem like it's something that is compatible with the current situation. So we'll get into more of the Falcons wide receiver issue. We'll talk about some potential trades for Calvin Ridley, as well as why Russell Gage seemed to fit in the Arthur Smith offense and Calvin Ridley didn't quite, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But I want to again thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And of course, I got to plug the Locked On Hawks podcast, where my guy Brad Rowland is giving you the lowdown every single day on the about the Atlanta Hawks. And of course, you can check out Locked On Hawks on the same podcast platforms that you're listening to Locked On Falcons. So we're talking about taking pay cuts. Why not find ways to cut what you're spending at the pump? And you can do so now with a new app called GetUpside, where you get cash back for every gallon of gas that you put in your car and save every time you fill up. And there's no catch. It's all free. You can download GetUpside for free in the App Store or on Google Play. All you got to do is open the app, go to one of the thousands of eligible gas stations near you, claim the offer, fill up, and they will put money directly into your account. And you can then cash out anytime you want with payments directly into your bank account, PayPal. I like to get them on Amazon gift cards. And now when you open an account on GetUpside and use the promo code touchdown, when you sign up, you get a bonus 25 cents back per gallon on your first fill up. So don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Download the free GetUpside app and use the promo code touchdown when you sign up. That's GetUpside, promo code touchdown, to start saving every time you fill up. So BetOnline remains the number one spot for all your sports wagering action in 2022. And you already can see the odds for the 4 possible Super Bowl matchups already up at betonline.ag. And right now they're all between 2.5 to 3.5 points. And so if you put money down now, I think you're going to get some pretty good odds this week that you may not get come Monday, when those odds are changed and we know who's going to be in playing for the Super Bowl. So head on over to take advantage to betonline.ag. And when you sign up, use the promo code locked on and you'll get a 50% welcome bonus. That means if you deposit $200, you get $100 on free money to play with. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on all your favorite sports, from football, basketball, hockey, boxing, UFC, all the way to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait and take advantage of all the amazing offers available at BetOnline, where the game starts. So our next question comes from Justin Sandu at Justin201224. He asks, in hindsight, do you think the Falcons would be better off today if they drafted Jamar Chase instead of Pitts? I am not a big fan of using hindsight for draft analysis, as so many other folks in the world out there are. So I don't want anybody to hear my answer to this and interpret it as me saying, oh, the Kyle Pitts pick was bad. But I do think, sort of, if you're going to use hindsight and based off of what we know now about the Falcons wide receiver group, you can certainly make a pretty easy case that Chase would have been the better pick, especially given that Chase had objectively a better season than Kyle Pitts. I think Chase is hands down the favorite to win Offensive Rookie of the Year. I know there's some people that think Mac Jones deserves it, but I think Chase clearly deserves it. I guess the question is going to be, are we using our hindsight? Because again, at the time, we thought Julio was going to be here. We didn't expect Calvin Ridley to depart midway through the season. So we didn't know those things, but the team certainly, at least theoretically, knew that Julio Jones wasn't going to be here. So again, how much of a factor do you put into that? And then how much do you factor if Chase is on in this offense? How effective is he with Matt Ryan versus with Joe Burrow, a quarterback that he's played a number of times and playing in a Bengals offense that at least this year was a little bit more vertical and more explosive. So is he as good in Atlanta as he was in Cincinnati? I don't know the answer to that. So that's part of it why I don't necessarily like to do hindsight, because you're just kind of, it doesn't always work, right? Let's move on to Dirty Bird Digest's question. He says, I know you think that Calvin Ridley isn't a good fit in Arthur Smith's offense, but do you think that Smith has evolved in what we saw with Russell Gage showing out on the back end of the season? Are Gage and Ridley comparable in your opinion? So I do think Arthur Smith did a better job utilizing Russell Gage in the second half of the season. It seemed like those bunch formations really did benefit him in that regard. I do think Gage is probably a little bit better suited for Arthur Smith's offense than Ridley. I don't think they're that comparable. I don't know if Gage really has any standout traits as a wide receiver, other than that he's athletic and he can jump really high. We know that Ridley can't jump really high, but I think that sort of gives Gage a little bit more malleability that allows him to fit in a multitude of different offenses. While I think Ridley has clearly defined strengths and clearly defined weaknesses, that means that you kind of have to tailor your offense a little bit more to his strengths if you want to get the best version of Calvin Ridley. And we've seen that over the last couple of years with Sark and Cutter. We're doing a better job than that. And I'm being somewhat hyperbolic when I say this, but when you look at outside receivers in this Arthur Smith offense, they kind of run two routes. It's fades and crossers. That's basically or variations of those types of routes. And those aren't really the strengths of Calvin Ridley. I wouldn't sit here and tell you that those are strengths of Russell Gage. But it's one of those things where like it's not a weakness of Russell Gage either. If you ask me what's Gage's best route, I probably couldn't tell you because I don't think there's one specific route or route combination that he's at his best at. Again, going back to that malleability question, you look at Calvin Ridley. It's not that Calvin Ridley can't run crossers or can't run fades or whatever the case may be. He's done that and had success running those types of routes in the past. But again, I'm pulling these numbers out of my butt. But like, in the past, it was like 15 to 20% of his routes were those types of routes. And in this past year's offense, it was like 60 or 70% of his routes. And so all of a sudden you're taking a player that, that only needed to be effective doing that stuff, 10% of the time or whatever the case may be. And now he needs to be effective doing that 50 or 60% of the time or whatever the case may be. And that's just incompatible for him. So I do think the possibility that Ridley had he continued to play with the Falcons would have been better in the second half. But I think that would have been due to Arthur Smith figuring out what his strengths and weaknesses are and finally making the adjustment to tailoring his offense to that. We saw that with Dirk Cutter in 2019, where those first couple of games, it wasn't as if Ridley was playing at a high level. He was effective, but like, it kind of took, 5 or 6 weeks before we really start to see Cutter figure out Calvin Ridley, and maybe the similar thing would have happened this past year. So we'll just sort of see about that. Lax Ned on Twitter asks thoughts on using Ridley as an asset to trade up with the Jags or Jets, and would that be a better trade for him, or would the Falcons be better off getting a second rounder for him because that's probably what the market is? Is it a better trade for him? Like, I wouldn't want to go to the Jags or Jets. If I was him, I would want to go to a contender. But so I don't know if that's a better trade for him. But I'm assuming that for you're looking at trading up into the top 4 because you want to get one of these premier pass rushers like Aiden Hutchinson or Kayvon Thibodeau. And when you look at the various trade value charts, what the normal move would be for the Falcons from going to 8-1. To sort of figure out what the trade would be. Like if they went from 8-1 with Jacksonville, the trade value charts seem to suggest that they would have to give up this year's 1, next year's 1, and both of this year's 2s. And so essentially you can maybe make the case that Ridley could stand in for any one of those assets. Some people might say next year's 1, you give up Ridley instead of next year's 1, or you give up Ridley instead of one of this year's 2s. Okay. But still at the end of the day, you're giving up 4 assets for 1. And I just don't think, unless you're trading up for a quarterback, that doesn't make a ton of sense to give up that for a non-quarterback, even if you're really high on Hutchinson and Thibodeau. Now, going from 8-4 seems a lot more palatable because the trade value charts say that that's probably this year's 1 and this year's 2, the 43rd overall pick at the top of round 2 would probably be enough to go from 8-4. And so therefore, again, maybe you give up this year's 1 in Ridley instead of this year's 2 as way. And then you're only giving up 2 assets for 1, which seems a lot more to make a lot more sense in that regard. As for that versus trading Ridley for a second outright, I don't really have a strong preference. Again, a lot of this is hard to say in a vacuum because like how I feel about trade, like in general, I'm against trading Ridley because I just think he makes your team better. But a lot of it depends on what other moves the Falcons make this offseason. And particularly, I'm willing to trade Ridley if I think it's going to allow you to get better in the trenches. But I also don't think that one move is going to do the job. And so you have to show me, particularly in free agency, what other moves that you made in addition to that. So in a world where we're trading up for, Thibodeau or Hutchinson, who I think are very good prospects, but aren't like necessarily like this Myles Garrett type of elite prospect. To me, they're more in the Bradley Chubb, Chase Young tier of sort of that next tier down of players. And I think, the Nick Boses and the Joey Boses, et cetera, are a little bit higher than those guys are. You gotta give me something in free agency. Like you gotta sit here and say, okay, we're going to take a hit in the passing game by trading Ridley, but we can make up for it by upgrading the offensive line, right? We did that in free agency, and now our offensive line is improved, and we also invested heavily in our defensive line in free agency, and now we can look at a guy like Hutchinson or Thibodeau as like the final piece to the puzzle or something like that. So in a vacuum, it's hard for me to get behind really any trade of Ridley at this point in time. But certainly there's circumstances if the Falcons can use that cap space that they get from Ridley to upgrade, the trenches this March, then certainly I could be a little bit more open to that idea. So we have more questions to come, including whether or not a certain wide receiver would be worth the 8th overall pick in Treylon Burks, and we'll get into that, as well as some other draft-related questions about Falcons trading back and potentially targeting a running back early in this draft as we continue today's Q&A episode. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Peacock and Williamson podcast, where NFL analyst Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson are giving you their daily coverage of all the latest news around the NFL, coaching hires, big trade talk, as well as this upcoming weekend's game. And of course, Peacock and Williamson is also headed to LA next month to cover Super Bowl 56. And so make sure you subscribe to the Peacock and Williamson podcast on whatever your preferred podcast platform is. So it's a new year, and that means people have New Year's resolutions. And if you are trying to get fit and eat healthier, of course, Built Bar should be included in your plan. Built Bar is a protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, even better than a candy bar, because Built Bars not only taste good, they're good for you. They're low in sugar, calories, and carbs, but high in protein and fiber. Eating healthy can be so boring, but Built Bar makes eating healthier fun and easier to stick to your resolution. And now if you head to built.com, you can find sales for factory seconds. So various flavors while supplies last are now on sale, discounted as part of their factory seconds sale. And so make sure you head over to built.com before supplies dry up. And when you do, use the promo code LOCK15 and you'll get 15% off your order. Again, that's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. So our next question comes from Mark at Dramatic Mark on Twitter. He asks, I think Treylon Burks would be a good pick for the Falcons at 8. Would love to hear your thoughts on that as a mailbag question. I'm not as high on Burks at 8. Certainly, I think Burks really does kind of fit what the Falcons may be potentially looking for at the wide receiver position. Again, going back to wide receivers just run fades and crossers, like Burks seems to run those routes. There's obviously going to be a lot of comparisons between him and AJ Brown between now and the draft. And I see those comparisons. That's the player that immediately jumped to mind when I watched him. And so when you look at the guys, the type of receiver that fits in this offense, again, running fades and crossers, Burks does seem to sort of fit the mold, but I kind of see Burks more as a second round talent, in large part due to the fact that I don't know how fast he is. To me, he's more like, he looks like a 4.55 guy. And that's typically a guy that goes in round 2. And like, if I'm going to take a wide receiver in the top 10, like I need to see that guy be an elite, a special player. And like, we know AJ Brown has turned in, was a second round pick. He's turned in a heck of a football player. You can argue he's one of the 5 to 7 best wide receivers in the game today. So it's not to sit here and say that just because you're graded out as second round talent means that you can't go on to be a very successful NFL receiver. Michael Thomas, Cooper Kupp, Chris Godwin, all these guys were day 2 selections that have gone on to become some of the best receivers in the game. Stephon Diggs was a 5th round pick. So it's not to sit here and say that you can't have success, but that's part of it, where it's like, we know that you can get good wide receivers on day 2 or day 3 of the draft. And so if I'm going to use a top 10 pick on a guy, he's got to be special. He's got to be Julio Jones type of guy. And, he's got to be a Jamar Chase. He's got to be a DK Metcalf. And I know I will continue to die on the hill that DK Metcalf should have been a top 10 pick in the draft. You got to be a special unicorn type of wide receiver. And for a guy like Treylon Burks at his size, 230 plus pounds, like unless he runs a sub 4.40, like to me, he's not going to be a unicorn. Like he can run faster. He can run a 4.45 or something like that, and that will make him a legit first round talent. But like, unless he's like that Julio Jones type of unicorn, that DK Metcalf type of unicorn, that Calvin Johnson type of guy, I'm not going to use a top 10 pick on him. Not to mention, I kind of think Drake London, the wide receiver from USC, is better. I think he's probably a little bit better separating. I think he's probably a better blocker or whatever the case may be. So I don't even know if Treylon Burks is the best of the big wide receivers in this draft class. So I would not be as big a fan of drafting him at 8. But again, I don't sit here and say like, oh, that's a terrible draft pick or anything like that. If he winds up being AJ Brown, no one's going to complain. But if he winds up being, less than that, then, like someone asked me like, what is his floor? And I was like, and he was like, Laquan Treadwell. And I know that's a terrible thing to say. And I was like, yeah, kind of like, but not like Minnesota Laquan Treadwell or Atlanta Laquan Treadwell, like the Treadwell that played for the Jaguars this year. Like that to me is kind of his floor, which is a guy that may struggle to separate at the next level and be a guy that catches like 30 or 40 passes. Big guy that, so like that could also be Treylon Burks. And you definitely don't want to use a top 10 pick if that's all he's going to be. So we'll just sort of have to see about that. Andy at Andy S. Gallagher asks, are there any positions outside of special teams that you couldn't make an argument for taking at pick 8? Center would probably be the only one. I'm not in love with drafting another undersized center in Iowa's Tyler Linderbaum as much as others are. Like Linderbaum is a very good prospect. If this was the Locked On Eagles podcast or Locked On Steelers podcast, I'd be all over Linderbaum probably at pick 8 if those teams had that pick 8. But given that the Falcons have already invested in undersized centers, I don't want to see the team go down that path again, even though I think Linderbaum is much better than Hennessy or Drew Dahlman. But it's just not so much better that suddenly I feel like we're just drafting, it just feels like we're just drafting a rich man's Matt Hennessy, which, give me Alex. If I'm going to use a top 10 pick on a center, I want it to be Alex Mack. And I don't think Linderbaum's on that level. Fourth string at Northern Falcon asks, even if they bring back CP and Davis, what do you think the chances are they draft a running back, perhaps with one of the second round picks on Spiller or Hall, etc., just to bring in some fresh young legs into the rotation? Or do they have the idea that Ollison could be that guy? So I hope the chances that they draft a running back are pretty high. Second round pick should definitely be in the mix, with the Falcons having possibly 2, possibly more picks, depending on what happens this offseason on day 2. As for Ollison, although he is my guy from Pitt, like I kind of think he's just a guy. He's kind of like a poor man's Jason Stelling to me. He's a guy that can be a solid RB3 that in the event of an injury to your RB1 or RB2, he can come in and give you some decent production off the bench, but I don't think he should be part of your RB1, RB2 plan. Maybe he can still develop into that guy and be a rich man's Jason Stelling down the road, but I wouldn't necessarily go into this offseason or into the future expecting that to be to be what happens. So that shouldn't be your plan moving forward. You should add to that position, and potentially in the draft makes a ton of sense. As for the 2 guys that you named, Isaiah Spiller of Texas A&M and Breece Hall of Iowa State, I like both of those guys. I kind of like Hall a little bit better because Iowa State actually runs outside zone stuff and Texas A&M doesn't run a ton of outside zone stuff, while Spiller has the skill set to be an effective outside zone runner. I don't always assume, like others, that a player can make that jump when they play in a different scheme. Like they played in one scheme in college, and you're going to ask them to play in a different scheme in the pros, and maybe they make the leap, maybe they make that adjustment, but maybe there's also a learning curve. And all of a sudden you're drafting a player that is not going to necessarily hit the ground running. You don't know those things. And certainly me sitting here on the outside, never having access to talk to these guys or interview these guys, I don't know that. Never going to talk to any of these coaches or anything like that. So it's one of those things where that's a bit of a projection to me. And I would much rather go with the quote unquote safer projection where I see a guy does X, Y, and Z, and he's going to be asked to do X, Y, and Z in the NFL, right? Rather than the guy that's asked to do A, B, and C in college. And now we're going to ask him to do X, Y, and Z in the NFL. So, between those two, while in a vacuum, you might say Spiller is probably better running back, and I wouldn't disagree with you. I feel like Hall, because of this potential scheme fit, probably should be a little bit higher on the Falcons draft board. Our next question comes from Jonathan Cole at GA Tech Fan 99. He asks, who are the most likely trade partners in a trade down within the first round? Would Washington make the most sense at 11 if they like one of the top quarterbacks? Well, I don't think a trade down partner is very likely at all, because typically teams don't trade into the top 10 unless they want to get a quarterback. And I don't see teams trading up for quarterbacks in this year's draft class. Again, never say never. People will insist to you that someone's always going to fall in love with a quarterback at the top of the draft, and maybe someone does. But I think, to really have a trade down option, you're probably going to need 2 teams to fall in love with a quarterback, or 2 quarterbacks that people fall in love with, as opposed to 1. Because if you're a team like Washington or whoever, and that there's only really one guy that's in the mix, then you can kind of just stand pat and hope the guy falls to you rather than, moving up to get him. But if you're sitting here talking about potential trade back options, and I know people will sit here and say, well, if you're not going to trade for quarterback, maybe there's someone come up for somebody else. Well, typically teams don't trade up for non-quarterbacks into the top 10. There's been like 3 of those trades in the last 5 drafts. 2 of them happened last year. Miami doing their weird thing where they traded back and then traded back up to 6, and they ultimately got Jalen Waddle, but they did that so that they can get one of the elite pass catchers, whether that was Pitts, whether that was Chase, whether that was Waddle in the draft. There's not a guy like that in this draft that is that sort of elite type of player. And you also technically can count Devontae Smith. The Eagles went from 12 to 10 to make sure that they got, the third pass catcher in the draft. And then you go back 2 years ago where the Steelers went from 20 to 10 to get Devin Bush. So the premium to trade up into that draft for a non-quarterback just doesn't make a ton of sense for a lot of teams. And particularly with this quarterback class, probably makes even less sense to the teams. But to answer your question, Jonathan, probably Washington is probably the most likely option just because the premium that they would have to pay from going from 11 to 8 will probably be just a 3rd round pick. And so that's not a huge amount to pay. If they do happen to fall in love with one of these quarterbacks, the further we go in the draft, the more that premium is going to be, and the less likely that one of those teams is going to be willing to sell it all for one of these quarterbacks based off what I've seen. But you never say never. Our last question comes from Debo at Debo on Twitter. He asks, when will the media in Atlanta start calling out the scouting / player personnel department from Mike to Dan to Arthur, Dimitroff to Terry? It seems we are making very similar mistakes, and no one talks about the guys feeding them bad player recommendations. Now, I'm curious, what sort of specifically are you referring to as the similar mistakes that the team is making? Because without understanding that, I can't really speak to this, because it sounds like you want, and I'll consider myself to be the part of the Atlanta media to answer your question, but like, it sounds like you want people to start calling out like directors of player personnel and area scouts for the Falcons messing up in the draft, which I don't know, doesn't make a ton of sense because they're not really the decision makers when it comes to stuff like this. And we don't necessarily know how much of a part they play. Every team is different in terms of how the scouts are treated. In certain cases, the scouts play a big part of a team's evaluation process. And sometimes like they're just, data collectors. And then ultimately the head coach or the general manager, or in some cases the owner, winds up making, unilaterally making those decisions. And we don't know how that quite works in Atlanta. I will sit here and tell you that I have the impression, based off of all the data, that under Dan Quinn, it was primarily the coaches that were making the decisions, just based off of how the Falcons suddenly switched from a 3-cone heavy team to a broad jump and 40-time heavy team under Dan Quinn, since Dimitroff and the scouting department sort of breed that Patriot school. And when you go back to the Mike Smith years, they were very much in love with guys that ran really good 3-cones, and that suddenly became basically not a drill that they cared about under Dan Quinn, except for wide receivers and corners. And then the fact that the Falcons would really feature all-star game guys also speaks to coaches having control. And right now, when we look at Terry and them, it's hard to really glean sort of what their process is like. So again, it's hard for me to sit here and be like, yeah, these area scouts are screwing over the Falcons. Because again, we could be in a situation, whether it's now or in the past, where an area scout like player A and a coach like player B, and the general manager sided with player B, with the coach, and went with player B in the draft. And so, me sitting here yelling at an area scout or Phil Emery or whoever you want me to call out, doesn't make a ton of sense. So it's a lack of information is the general thing I would say. Like, we just don't know how much of a contribution these guys have, and assuming that they're the reason why the Falcons are whiffing on picks. Again, you got to give me a little bit more of a specific example of what specifically you're talking about when we're talking about making some of the same mistakes. Is it just, missing on players? Like, then why are we, I don't know, but that'll do it. I don't have anything else to add, Debo. So that will do it for us here on today's Friday Q&A. I hope that answers all the questions that you guys sent in. I'm sure if you want to send in additional questions that we can answer potentially, next week, the plan moving forward for much of the off season will be to do Q&As either on Monday or Friday. We're going to probably do Friday until after the Super Bowl, and then we can start doing, mock draft Mondays, and then having some mailbags, and then maybe have, Fridays be leftover mailbag questions. So of course you can always hit me up on Twitter to send in those questions at Locked On Falcons, or on Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. or of course you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So guys, I appreciate you for tuning in, and I hope you make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day, but I always recommend second listens, including Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, but of course the Locked On Bets podcast, where handicapping expert Lee Sterling is giving you those daily picks, those blowout specials, and of course his lock of the day to help you make a little bit of money that you can use to go and buy some Built Bars, or you can use that money, that savings that you get from GetUpside, and then take Lee's advice to head on over to BetOnline to use that money and make a little bit of more money. So there you guys have it. Appreciate it. Till then.